Welcome back, everyone. I'm Cherokee Charles, the Cherokee that can see, and this is Chikimo. Now today, we're going to talk about what happened with the meeting yesterday between the president and Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman. It's always interesting, and I like to pay attention to what happens when those two get together. Whenever the president and the chairman of the Federal Reserve get together, something always interesting happens. But before we talk about the meeting and what they talked about, let's talk about the Fed itself and what they're all about. How did the Fed get created, and why do we need the Fed? There's been a lot of arguments that the Fed has been more harmful than good to the economy, and there's been tons of debate about what to do about it. So let's go back, and I'll go through my notes here. Let's go back to the creation of the Fed. And we're gonna go all the way back to April 18th, about 12 minutes after 5 a.m. in the morning in 1906. And this is in San Francisco. And at that moment in time, a huge earthquake hit San Francisco and destroyed the city. Now, when that happened, there was tons of people that were homeless, unemployment shot up, the stock market crashed about 50% of its value, and as time went on into 1907, banks just started to shut their doors. Now, when that happens, that creates a panic. Nobody wants to see banks starting to shut their doors and not give people their money. And when that happens, we have what's called a run on the bank. People start running to the bank to take their money out because they feel as though the banks can't be trusted. And around that time, banks didn't have the greatest reputation anyway. Coming out of the 1800s, banks didn't have the greatest reputation anyway. They were seen as greedy institutions. And a lot of people didn't trust banks. So when banks start to shut their doors, right away, people start to run on the bank. Now, when that starts to happen, the bankers, the bank owners, they have a problem on their hands. And they have to figure out what are we going to do when there's a run on the bank. And this isn't the first time that there was a run on the bank in 1907. But this time, during this run on the bank, the famous banker J.P. Morgan decided to take it upon himself to try and formulate a plan to figure out what are we going to do when there's a run on the bank. And people believe that banks are going to shut down, and they're going to lose all their money. So he took it upon himself to come up with this plan to stop runs on the bank. So here's what he did. He got a hold of the most powerful bankers in the United States, and he got them together all in a room, and he said to them, this is what we're going to do to stop runs on the bank. Each one of you guys is going to pledge $25 million. That's what you're going to do. And this $25 million that we're going to get from each of you is going to be used to stop banks from failing. Now, the bankers were surprised, and many of them balked at the idea because $25 million back in 1907 was a huge amount of money. But at the same time, bankers were losing a lot of money from bank runs. And they couldn't continue this cycle of banks running low on money and having to shut their doors, creating a bank run, which caused them to lose even more money. This cycle had to stop. And J.P. Morgan came up with this plan to try and stop that. Well, that particular plan wasn't received very well, so it dragged on until another person, Senator Aldridge, decided that he would take up the fight to try and figure out how we can save the banks and stop these bank runs. So Senator Aldridge got the bankers to come with him for a big conference meeting. And he said to them, listen, we've had panics before. We had the panic of 1819. There was another panic in 1837. There was a panic in 1893. There's another panic in 1896. Here we are in 1907. Another panic. So Senator Aldridge came up with a plan with these bankers down on an island resort called Jekyll Island. And the bankers came up with a plan after about a week of fighting amongst themselves to come up with this plan. And they came up with what's called today the Aldridge Plan. And they presented the Aldridge Plan to the government as the saving hope to stop banks from failing and to stop bank runs. And it went to the government and it lay there for a while, but however, by December of 1913, the then President Woodrow Wilson finally signed the bill into law, and it was called the Federal Reserve Act. And that launched what we now know today as the Federal Reserve. Now, there's a couple of things about the Federal Reserve that you have to understand. The Federal Reserve is not a federal agency. It's not a government agency. It's an organization that is designed to keep banks from failing. And the way they do this is by, when banks start to run low on cash, the Federal Reserve loans that particular bank money to keep them afloat, so that they don't go under and so that there isn't a run on the bank. So the Fed will loan that bank money at a particular rate to keep them afloat. And that's how we have this interbank loan rate. And that's what you hear about when the government talks about raising interest rates. They're raising the interbank loan rate. Now, the government just recently raised that interbank loan rate by 0.5%. And by doing that, that consequently raised all the rates that banks charge each other and the rate that banks charge us. So your credit card rate is affected, mortgage rates are affected, your car loan rate is affected. Everything gets affected because the Federal Reserve has raised the interbank rate, which in turn banks will raise the rate for loans. Now, here's the job of the Fed. The job of the Fed is this. As I said, they are supposed to loan money to banks who are close to or starting to run low on money. That's number one. Number two, the Fed's job is to control the money supply. You don't want to have too much money floating around, and you don't want to have too little money floating around. So it's the Fed's job to kind of balance the money supply so that there's just enough money around so that people have money to make purchases, and that there's not too tightening of money so that you have people trying to find money to buy things. And now the third thing that the Federal Reserve is charged with is to control inflation. And the Fed has a way of doing that. We just talked about that. They have the ability to raise interest or lower interest rates. Now, for the longest time, the Fed has kept interest rates unusually low, and that has created a lot of people having too much money. A lot of people feel that there's been too much money in circulation. And when that happens, the stock market is affected, and people usually take that money and they invest. They invest in the stock market, and the stock market will go up when there's a lot of money in supply. Now, the Fed is supposed to remain independent. It's supposed to be independent of the government. And the president is not supposed to be able to try and influence the Fed on what to do to control the money supply. Now, that hasn't always been true. There have been presidents that have influenced, or at least attempted to influence, the Federal Reserve policy on what to do about inflation. And in fact, the most recent one that I can think of that caused a huge problem was with President Nixon. During the 70s, there was a lot of inflation, and President Nixon went to the Fed and said, listen, you have to do something about inflation. You have to do something about all the interest rates. You know, it's going crazy. People are getting hurt. So you have to do something. So President Nixon got involved with Fed decisions on monetary policy, and he pressured the Fed to do something about the country's inflation and the economy. And as a result, the Fed did. They started to raise interest rates and tighten the money supply. And they tightened and tightened and tightened. And I believe the Fed tightened the money supply so much that the interest rates were hovering around 18 to 20% for just a simple mortgage. And I can't imagine people trying to go out and buy a home and they're faced with looking at interest rates on a mortgage loan up around 15 to 18%. Now, that's incredible that the president was able to pressure the Fed so much that the Fed, they kind of overdid it, you know, by getting so much pressure from the president. They kind of overdid it. And that's why we ended up with interest rates so high at that time. But this time, President Biden is telling the Fed, I'm not going to interfere with you and your decision making. I'm not going to interfere. I'm not going to try and pressure you and tell you what to do. It's your responsibility. It's your job to figure this whole thing out. But I want, and the people of the United States want to get control of inflation. So in the meeting, that supposedly is the gist of the meeting. The president saying, we need to do something about inflation. It's the Fed's job to control inflation, but it is also not the president's job to get involved. It is not the president's job to control inflation. And it's kind of interesting because whenever there's inflation and the economy is bad, and it is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve to control inflation and control the money supply. But if that doesn't happen, the Federal Reserve doesn't get the blame. It's the president's office that gets the blame for that. So even right now, people are looking to the president to control inflation. It's not the president's job. It's the Federal Reserve's job to control inflation. It's just kind of a weird way of looking at things. And I think people look to the president to control inflation because he's the president and they feel as though he should do something to something about this. But I just want everyone listening to my voice to understand it is not the president's job to control inflation. It's the Federal Reserve's job to control inflation. It's unfortunate that If inflation is not under control, the president's going to get the blame, for sure. And that's exactly what is happening and what will happen. So I want to leave you with that because I feel as though a lot of people have it a little bit twisted when it comes to who's responsible for controlling inflation and who's going to get the blame for it if inflation goes crazy. So as usual, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I'm Cherokee Charles, the Cherokee that can see. And as usual, I'll see you in the next one.